So I want to thank you all for such a wonderful day of papers. I think I speak for us all when we feel very lucky to be in the room for such incredible work and to be part of this conversation. And one question that came to my mind and thinking about Martin, as you were speaking about close looking and what the benefits of that are, and I know, Jennifer, that's a large part of your teaching too, and I think as Americanists, we often delight in an object and putting an object at the center of a large web that we weave of observation and putting it in a huge web of influence. So I'd love to hear about close looking in your work, David, and in the papers that we heard about today.
Are we on here? Yes. Well, Martin and I have had wonderful debates about art and life and everything since he was a freshman at Colby College, and I can tell he's not giving up. He's not going to throw in the towel just yet. But I think Martin is a scholar who's made a very good point against, in a sense, what Jennifer does and what Alex does in the viability, the sort of purpose of close looking. And as I think he was saying today, that when you're trying to, all of us descend intellectually from somebody named Jules Prown, who was a professor at Yale for many years. And Prown stressed the importance of close looking, trying to remove the brackets you have, the sort of ideological presuppositions you have when you look at a work of art or any object, any material object. And so that was drilled into us very much by Jules. But on the other hand, there's a rebellion against the Jules method that Martin has admirated, that you can't get rid of your intellectual presuppositions. They're part of the air you breathe, the cosmic dust that you breathe. And so that it's not fatuous, but from that point of view, impossible to ever see things in their original form, contextless. So I'll just throw that out there.
I mean, I could say something here because I probably have, I've carried the close-looking Jules method out into the world in a way that has been has surprised me. But you know, I'm not sure that it comes down to a binary between close-looking and historical sensitivity. I actually reject that distinction. And I talk about this with my students quite a bit. You know, why won't we just be importing all of our own biases into the work if we are forced to look at this for 3 hours and record our every response to it? And I think that it is possible for that to happen, that one can look at a work of art and just see what you want to see according to your own blinders and biases. But I also believe that if you don't attend closely to the work, you're not ever even in a position where you can ask the question of whether your response to the work might be different from someone's in the past or the future. So say I were looking at an Archibald Motley painting and I thought I saw a stereotype, it would take me a while to even get to the point of seeing and noticing that, and then I would have to say, okay, but is that in fact what the artist meant, or is that in fact what would have happened in the past? So I think that it's not so much about that close looking itself is problematic, but it's what you do with it and how you use it to generate questions. I think the kind of questions that get pulled out of a close-looking exercise are very different between the two of you. But I don't think that looking carefully necessarily means that you're discounting historical specificity. It opens you up to different ways of looking for historical specificity.
I would just say briefly, my own point of view is maybe somewhat similar to Jennifer's, but a little different, which is I think it's precisely through one's subjectivity, so-called, that one can find a kind of truth. And I would just describe that as an insight that is available to a sensitive observer who has a modicum of self-awareness and can, make what is true for them true or possible for others. And that obviously has connections to art history as a creative method, something in line with, say, a novelist's work or something like that. But I also think it has something in common with being, the relationship between being wrong and being right, if I can put it like that. That long ago, back in New Haven, Harold Bloom talked about a strong misreading, and the idea of getting something so sublimely wrong or off, let's say, that it turns out to have the kernel of an insight about the work. And it takes the work to a different place and causes a person in the world to see the work anew, which touches on then what we do as scholars, which we've heard so many productive meditations on today. But just very briefly, one definition would be we conserve the past and portray it in its true look, and we peel away the layers of misunderstanding and falsity, as Martin has talked about, in order to see it with the right subtlety and respect. Another is that we create the work anew in the moment in which we speak or write it, and cause the work to be seen again in its difference or otherness from who we are, which I take to be the higher goal of what we do. And yeah, although I understand where Martin's coming from, I think obviously deconstruction played a role in our own cultural moment, in terms of dispensing with facts, et cetera, but I don't think that kind of fakery and foolery is to be confused with the work of imagination, which at a glance might seem to be something almost similar, but of course it's not. It's a kind of rich, considered invention that creates a world for us, which is then a space of ethical possibility.
I'll just say super briefly, because I want Katherine to get David talking more, that there was a time in my life when I certainly would have liked a unified field theory of art history, one theory that would do it all. And one of the nice things about aging, for me at least, is I've become less dogmatic, I think. And I do, to circle back to Jennifer, I do agree that we need all of these tools in our arsenal, but I lean a particular way.
Well, something that Alex was talking about was, why are we doing this? Why are we here? What's the purpose of being an art historian or a scholar, or in these troubled times, being a university professor when there's a lot of negative drag on being at a university right now? But Alex really summed it up when he made a private joke to me. Why'd you do it, Dave? And he was talking about an incident when I was a graduate student in New Haven, and there was snow all over the city, and my car was parked in what turned out to be an illegal place, and the car was towed away. So the next day, with my wife, I went to the tow place, and the gate was open. And so I saw my car, and I drove it back to my house. And 2 arresting officers came. And one of them said, "Why'd you do it, Dave?" And that's really been the existential question I've been asking ever since. Why am I doing this? So I don't know that we've actually received answers today, but I've been thinking a lot since we've had this discussion. one of the things I would love to impart to my students is a love of life. And yeah, obviously I think they love life to a great extent, but to me that's one of the great purposes of a professor, of an intellectual, is to enhance the reader or the viewer or the student's love of life, love of learning, love of experience, expansion of horizons. Anyway, so I'll stop there.
Well, Martin alluded to your vast personal archive, of which I have been cohabitating over the past year. I'd love to hear about what you have gathered over the years and how you see that as important to your work. And your book on Sunset Boulevard is about to come out to commemorate its major anniversary. So thinking about perhaps how you use your personal archive as a scholar. So I'll open that to David first, and then would love to hear from others who, return to things of the past and what you hold on to and how that shapes your work.
Oh boy, this is heavy, because yeah, as you've been hearing, I've been a professor for 45 years, so I have a lot of accumulated SHIT. But to me, it all smells great. So every time I find an old receipt from Atticus Bookstore in New Haven, it brings back not only the bookstore or what I had for dinner that night, but also the frame of mind that I was in when this book just seemed absolutely essential to me. With what little money I had and what even less space I had on my bookshelves, I had to get that book because it was going to unlock not everything to me, but help me figure out where I was going, where I needed to go. I always think Gauguin's question about who are we, where are we going, what are we doing? I don't remember the exact quote, but that's what those papers, and that's why it's so hard for me to part with them, because when I pick them up, then they resonate. They're little poems to me, or to the past, or to the students who I save student papers from which I learn a lot. And when I see a student paper from the past, I remember that student, and that paper is like the Madeleine cookie that brings me right back to that experience. So I can't get rid of things because it's like getting rid of my students. But now I'm really going to start weeping, so I'll pass the... You can answer that one.
First of all, I'm struck by how the way these artifacts in your life open up in the same way that you open up works of art. That this whole history blooms forth from this piece of matter, this organized scrap of matter. But I think it's a beautiful expression of the importance of maintaining our own experiences as part of our work, that you have never been interested in factoring out your own experience, and Martin spoke about this beautifully. And it's actually something I've been thinking a lot about with space imaging and with images like the one I talked about today, is in that scientists, almost everything in that pastel would be referenced as, would be called an artifact in scientific circles. And in science, artifacts are things that you need to take out of images. The little glitches, the pieces, parts that are out of focus. In space imaging, there's actually cosmic rays all over the original raw data that it all gets taken out as artifacts of the apparatus. So scientists think that they need to remove all these signs of relations and signs of distance and signs of the glitches and chance effects that plague every image. But of course, historians and humanists, for us, artifacts are exactly what we're after. That's where all the good stuff is. That's where the history is and where experience is. And I mean, I want to go forward and work with scientists and try to convince them to leave some more artifacts in their images, because when you take artifacts out of the universe, you're basically taking the universe out. And so I love that you're keeping all of this archive, and I hope it will be kept here in some format, because
Anybody have a story?
you know, it's the true embodiment of your method, I think.
Yeah, David, the way that you can recall student names, we were talking at dinner last night, students who wrote a fabulous paper, back in the late 90s that really inspired you, and he has the name just right at the top of his head. And I wanted to also think about, for all of us, about the kind of audience that we write for. I think perhaps David has written for the most vast different types of audiences, from Rolling Stone initially to now writing for academic audiences, and then also trade books as well. So how do you modulate that authorial voice when you're writing for different groups, or not? How do you try to keep that integrity of who you are when you're speaking to an audience?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Because I remember the first time I was attending a university class somewhere, and the professor was very formidable and wanted you to feel his formidableness. And I kind of pictured him going to the bathroom. Because that was my way, for me, of just reminding myself that he's a human being. And that's sort of, I don't think of all my students about going to the bathroom, but and maybe they don't think that about me, but when I try to see that every student, whenever I give lectures, every audience member, every reader, whether I'm writing for Rolling Stone or for a trade press, is a human being with essential human needs, and they're all sort of, in the end, we're human beings. One of the big influences of my life, a great influence, and somebody we talked about the other night who befriended me when I was a young film student, was the French filmmaker Jean Renoir. Renoir just constantly made that point to me, that we're all human beings, no matter directed films or you're a lowly film student like I was. We're all sort of under the skin, we're all human beings. And that kind of message of humanism, I've wrote it through the deconstruction years when it was very unpopular to be a humanist. And now in certain ways it's unpopular to be a humanist. But I guess that's been my core value in wanting, I think Martin pointed this out, or Alex, I don't remember which, but I've always try to have dialogue with my readers from page to page to page, rather than ever sort of make it seem as if there's some intellectual dust is coming down from outer space, some dictum from outer space. I'm trying to locate what I perceive at the moment that I'm perceiving it on the page. I want a record of that, a thumbprint of that on the page when I write. As for me, it's a kind of act of honesty. Anyway. Next question.
Well, I think first of all, your writing gave me permission, and I think a lot of us permission, to write with a capital W instead of just generate academic scholarship, to care about the way we were constructing arguments, to care about the words we use, to try to tell a story, to produce a narrative, and to respect our audiences, to broaden and respect them, because your work doesn't simply take in this enormous, universe of different disciplines and different audiences. You really write in such a way that you're not writing about Kennedy or any of the characters in your work. You're not writing about them so much as you are writing with them or opening conversations with them. And that can be very difficult to do, especially in interdisciplinary contexts where it's easy to go out, say, to the sciences and get some information and bring it back and process it through art history, and you're talking about scientists. It's a lot harder to actually sit down with a scientist and have a reciprocal conversation about how you can influence each other's work. And I learned that from you, David. I learned that from the way you open art history to so many other kinds of people and make it translatable to them and get them invested in what we do, and therefore broadening the impact of everything that we do.
I'm just curious, David, following the last question, do you feel like you modulate your voice for different publications? Because I feel like you have a distinctive voice that whether you're writing for a popular audience or a more academic one, it's always David to me. But do you feel like you're making adjustments?
Basically, no. I mean, I'm trying to use the same voice consistently throughout everything I write and do. My teaching, my lecturing, my conversation. Somebody early on in my career, these guys have heard this story, but I was at some event at the Metropolitan Museum, and some distinguished art historian came up to me and said, "Oh yes, you're David Lubin. You're the man who makes up things about paintings." And she meant that as an insult, but I was so flattered. So, yeah, I want my readers, whether they're academic readers or general audience readers, to have a good ride. I mean, that's what you're putting your money down for, is you want a good roller coaster ride, and I want to give it to you. I'm a showman at heart.
Well, if I may say, so that story is interesting. I was thinking of another one from the Yale days. You've told me about this before, where a fellow PhD student, I think, said, with, I think, disdain and disappointment, "David, your prose is so consumable." Do you think there's any relationship between that kind of criticism and the one you heard from the fancy art historian? Or are those just two different modes of antagonism?
I think there were two modes of antagonism. When the fellow PhD student said that to me, I think in a way she was deep down, I mean, I'm not to second guess her, but sort of envious that I was writing in a way, in prose that I want prose that drips, that has some richness to it. And so I take pleasure in writing, and I want my reader to share that pleasure in reading my stuff. So I think the one who said that about your prose is just too consumable, that was the other problem. But the distinguished scholar had, and this is germane to what we've been talking about now, sort of a sense that there is a truth, a rock hardcore reality to what a painting is about, or what it said to its audiences. And I think she didn't like the fact that I was saying from the get-go in my books, I can never really know what this painting was or what its audience was thinking about. I can make educated guesses and take you along on that journey with me, but I'm not going to come back and say, and this is what it means. You want to argue with that?
I think when you're taking big imaginative leaps with your scholarship, it is important to ground that in imagination. And I think imagination has been a big through line of these talks today.
But if I just wanted to ask you about this following on this, and maybe channeling a little bit of Martin's point of view, and maybe Jennifer's too. Like, here's a question for you as you reflect. Like, I understand you're too careful and too honest in a way to insist on one meaning. But is there some kind of touching of ground? Like, do you think there's something that's foundational in your work that just is a truth of it? I don't know, again, that has to be distinct from giving people a good ride. I think of this very weird and, to me, wonderful Wyeth painting out there called Snow Hill, where his characters from different paintings are all dancing around the maypole. It's like, that's a great late life work. Like, Yeats calls it the circus animals' desertion. That is, the circus animals, the different characters come, and here they're not deserting Wyeth, but appearing for one last dance. So those are your books. dancing around, and yet what is the center? What is the central question? I don't think that's like putting you on the spot in terms of like asking you to dogmatize your work. I'm just curious what have you been driving at besides giving people a good ride?
Well, also giving myself a good ride at the same time.
Yeah.
But, so to historicize, when I was in graduate school in the late 70s and 80s, it was the period of deconstruction and Derrida and Foucault and Barthes. And these writers had a huge influence on me in the way I thought about things, and thought it seemed reactionary to me to nail down one specific meaning to a work of literature, a work of art, even a work of historical data. I thought it's wrong to make it unitary and pin it down. But now, many years later, we live in what people call a post-truth era, when truth is very much under suspicion, or people say, well, how do you know this is true? And, you know, I don't need to get into the political climate of today. You're all living in it right now, but it does make me want to be more cautious about making truthful statements. But in the end, I keep going back to Alex's point earlier about, and I don't remember exactly how you were talking about, but that in the end, what is the purpose of being here? Being an art historian, being a human being, what is our purpose? What's it all amount to? And if I had the answer, I'd put it on a fortune cookie and serve you dinner right now, but push.
I don't think it's for us to say, but we leave a body of work that has we imagine has some kind of integrity, and that creates an openness or a set of possibilities for others. And then those people, let's just say, some people take it up, whatever. I don't think that's the same as like so many points of view or subjectivity. I'm not quite, subjectivity is in let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think it has more guts and texture than that. As obviously we're sitting here in this stage, so we're embodying a certain kind of intellectual lineage, which is not aleatory exactly, though I myself rely on chance so much. But I think sometimes we sell each other and what we do pretty short. Again, I would just say there's some distinction between, on the one hand, being either absolutely right or somehow sheepishly acknowledging one's fancies, and then in true academic fashion, feeling guilty about one's complicity in regimes that have appropriated this, that, or the other thing. I just think there's some other way that's always present for all of us, and there's some tragedy involved where we don't acknowledge that. And that other way has to do something with the sky or the ground, something that's just very beautiful and distinctive, which maybe just by virtue of being alive we can't really understand, because we can't know our own lives from outside those lives. We just have to experience them. But just think, we're too modest, too kind, too anxious, and too guilty and sad to really understand how beautiful this is. And that's a failure on whose part? Ours. No, it's true. I don't know what it is. Like, maybe it's because we're nice, you know, and we're just very concerned to not be obnoxious and be proud and so on. I understand that that's not what the world needs, but I just think, you know, you have a certain gift, David, and then it's not your place to, of course, to articulate what your gift is, but I would want you to acknowledge it, you know, and that it's a real thing in the world, and it's not just another subjectivity. I mean, this is a rare thing in the world, is my point.
One thing, and thank you for that, and yes, I am not going to sit down now and tell you what all my writing means.
But that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know. But I am very proud, as I think about it, that all three of these brilliant intellectuals, I pissed them off so many times over the years. I can remember once in Williamstown, Jennifer, you were so angry when I kept pushing you about an article you had written, and it was a draft. Yeah.
I don't remember this. You can remind me.
But that's part of the joy of the intellectual life and the scholarly life is pushing, not in a hateful, mean-spirited way, but I'm feeling Alex is pushing me right now in a way that makes me want to sock him. No. But that is an unacknowledged part of one of the joys of the Academy is when you can have good-spirited antagonism over an idea and dig in your heels and sort of resist, push back against what your friend is doing and saying.
If you're not being critiqued, you're not part of the conversation. So, I'm currently reading Alex's very brilliant book, The Forest, which you should read if you haven't already, and thinking about the weird and wonderful objects that make their way into the book, like logs and hats and clocks, and thinking about David's obsession with the Zapruder film and Jennifer's with the Mars pastels. So I'd love to hear about pushing maybe some genre boundaries of what the art historian can and can't look at, perhaps starting with the Zapruder film and what drew you to that in the first place as an art historian, and thinking that I, as an art historian, have something really interesting to say about this object.
I don't know, when I decided I was going to teach, this is my first semester at Wake Forest, and I wanted to teach a seminar on sort of important images of the 20th century. And as organizing this course, it occurred to me that some of the most famous photographic images of the 20th century came about in one weekend in November in 1963. So I decided to teach a course on that weekend in November 1963. And each student picked a photograph from that weekend. And I think I assigned one of the students to do the Zapruder film. And so I was sort of experiencing these texts with them, and we would talk about them each week. And then it occurred to me that the Zapruder film is only 26 seconds long, but it has the classic structure of a 3-act movie. And so once I had that perception, then it just opened up how it's a movie, after all. And what do movies have in common? You know, they have structure, even if it's a purely abstract work of cinema. It has some kind of structure, and I was trying to get at that, not because I was a structuralist or a post-structuralist, but I just was trying to understand why that piece of cinema seemed so resonant, and the same with those photographs. So I guess it was starting off the aleatory thing. I mean, I was teaching a course, and I thought this would be cool to teach a course on the 60s, because I grew up in the 60s, so I particularly enchanted by that decade. So that turned out to be a book. But it wasn't, there was no rational plan, or it wasn't a dogma that I wanted to say that art and popular culture are equivalent. But I did want to explore the crossovers and boundaries between art and popular culture.
I mean, I think art history is a way of being in the world, and not a form of selection of proper objects. I've always been frustrated by what I would call fine art snobbery, which you get a lot of at Harvard. And it doesn't make any sense to me not to look at, that pastel drawing or the Zapruder film. And I think it's partially because, again, I grew up under the influence of David's writing, and the ability to move between these different forms of images and let them inform each other. And I actually think that if we aren't able to move into these other forms of visual culture and imagery and bring our knowledge to them, then we're really unnecessarily limiting our work in the world and our influence on the world. I mean, to take Alex's point that we tend to be maybe a little bit too uncertain about why we're here and what we can do. I actually think that art historians, and I would also consider artists in this general group of people who know how to think about images and know how to think about their histories and their complexities and their struggles, have a lot of work to do in the world. And in my case, it has to do with space imaging. Like, how do we know what's out there? The only way we know what's out there is through images, and the people who are making these images have virtually no training in the humanities or the arts. It's not that they're bad people, but they just don't have any of these perspectives. And I really want to talk to them, and I will learn from them, and they can learn from me. But if I immediately discount those images as anything that I would have anything to say about, I just feel that I'm unnecessarily limiting the value of this kind of adventure that Alex talked about. I think we have important work to do, and part of it is being sitting alone in our rooms and struggling with ideas and being curmudgeonly about the world, but then we also have to go back out and work with the world and talk to people. So I think it's really dangerous to say that we can only write about American painting or American anything or any particular kind of genre. I'd like to see a lot of those boundaries removed. And I was really struck by something that you kept talking about, Martin, and namely this notion of docility. I think docility is the biggest concern that we have in the world of art history and in the world of the humanities and in the world in general. I mean, if we allow images to be the kind of docile purveyors of the status quo, even of their own status quo, then we have failed.
Yeah, I'll just add my point of view, which is on the same side, but from an opposite point of view, which is I feel like the way that I would relate to a clock or a painting, and I agree with Jennifer, I hardly pay attention to the difference, though I love fine art painting, and I am a snob in that way. I think I think that not wakefulness but sleep is actually my medium for connecting with these works. Like, it's a little bit dreamlike, and I try to suspend, I don't know if it's common sense, but I try to approach the work as it approaches me, and to understand the encounter as not really a real world one, but as a mystical one, with the writing having something of that flavor too, and then that the ethical result of that is, again, bringing something forth in the world for others, not to fight the good fight against those who misappropriate images, and et cetera, though, of course, I'm all on the side of that fight, but rather to create something other. And it, in my teaching that's gone from deconstruction style immaturities to something else that's more generous, I think the space I'm going for has to do with words like hope and possibility and openness, which are scandalous to my more left-leaning colleagues because they savor of different kinds of, kind of whatever, like elitist, privileged kind of conjecturing. Those who can afford not to know is how it was put back in the 80s. But gladly, I'm more and more indifferent to such criticisms because, they just don't get it. They don't get it that students, for example, as much as they can be brought to life by learning the rules of critique and the power of critical engagement, can also, as I was hearing from one of David's students just in the break, a space to think and to be allowed to come into being independent of ideological requirements, rules of engagement, et cetera, is a deeply ethical thing. And I think as I talk, I feel like David's work has, for many years, sort of brought me along in that way of goodness.
I'd just like to say I completely agree with you, and I didn't mean to imply that. I think what I said was that what I would have meant to say was this precisely this openness and this dreamy, mystical other space that is the skill of the art historian, and that's what somehow we need to open for people who are outside of our field.
Yeah, and I think at its sort of pedal meets metal way, if that's the term, which David's work does better than anyone's. It's an art historian is just someone who writes about art. That's all. That's it. So then it becomes like, well, how are you doing it? With your evidence or with your storytelling. But that is the whole thing. And so everyone has their different ingredients of how they do it, but its success stands or falls on that one procedure of putting words to images, objects. And David, every sentence, I know, just to sort of ventriloquize Martin's beautiful close of his talk, it's like, I know the editors will want, David's still trying to change sentences at the end, like way after the point of no return, the boat is going to Hong Kong with the pages. I just like, and it's not anything major, it's just like this comma. And so, but that's an example of someone understanding, I think, that it's through and through writing, and that's the job, and then how you do it is everything, and that's a very real world thing in its hermeticism.
We haven't made much of a distinction this afternoon between art history and American studies. And when I think of your boundary crossing, I think of it linked to American studies, where it was in the 70s and the 80s. How important do you think it was to you? And I think to changing American art history, the perspective you brought to bear.
That's the question?
Yeah.
Maybe for the reception.
Yeah, we gotta move along. Did you want to ask the audience any questions?
I think we're gonna enjoy questioning at the party, which is about to begin. So by way of closure, I wanted to thank you all and then invite Professor Morna O'Neill up to give our closing remarks and end out the day.
And we all want to thank Katherine and Gregory.
Yes, thank you.